Well, uh, this is unusual. Usually we have a bunch of the women who are left. The guys drop out, and we have guys today, so that's good. Um, One of the ways to look at utilitarianism is it was developed, among other things, in reaction to empiricism, in reaction to David Hume's skepticism about morality and moral judgments. David Hume, and I was looking for the quote because I have it on my flash drive, but basically he says, look, you take an action like willful murder. Say it's a vicious action. It has the quality of vice or moral wrongness. But as an empiricist, David Hume challenged people to look at that action as closely as you could and see if you can find empirically, by observation, the quality of moral wrongness or vice we want to say an action like willful murder has. And Hume says, you look at that as closely as you might, you never will find it. He says, the only thing you're going to find empirically is not out there in the action, but inside of you, in your own reaction to it and your own attitude toward it. He said, you will either have a feeling of approval or disapproval for a given action. And so for David Hume, moral judgments simply translate into reports about our own psychological attitudes toward various actions. In other words, if I say, stealing is wrong or murder is wrong, all I'm doing is saying, I, Vic Morawski, disapprove of those actions. If I'm saying, well, we're having a drive going on collecting canned goods and you got to donate to it, or my fellow faculty members should, I'm saying, well, if I say that's a morally right thing to do, all I'm saying from David Hume's perspective is, I, Vic Morawski, approve of, donating to that cause. Well, it's not just, so morality for Hume becomes just a matter of each person's subjective call. And if Hume's right, morality is a matter of feelings, not something that reason has anything to do with. So the bottom line is, the result of Hume's skepticism about moral judgments is that we can't really reason out what we want to do in a moral situation, that moral reasoning goes by the wayside. Now, it's not just very conservative, say, Christian believers who were repulsed by this type of extreme skepticism about morality, but it was also secular moralists who said, well, we don't want to go where Hume wants to send us. We don't want to say that, okay, moral matters aren't anything about which we can objectively reason. And so one way of looking at what the utilitarians did, and Kant in Germany had a totally different way of responding to Hume's skepticism, but they were both, the utilitarians and the Kantians, they were both trying to get back ways of restoring moral matters as something we can reason about. And so the utilitarians thought if we can get reasoning about morality out of the realm of the otherworldly and bring it down to earth, then once more we can show how we can reason about moral right and wrong. And that's what they tried to do. Now, you notice in the opening slide, I have an old-fashioned chemical balance, like maybe you saw them in chemistry lab, or I don't know how many labs even have them anymore, but you'd put the weight of the chemical you wanted to measure in one of the pans, and then you'd pour the chemical into the other pan until it balanced out with the weight. Well, what utilitarians said is if we can balance out the good and the bad results of our actions and say that the morally right thing to do is what produces more good than bad results. And if we can interpret those results in terms of something we're acquainted with here in the real world, and they did in terms of people's happiness or unhappiness, pain and pleasure, then they said we can once more show how we can reason about a moral matter. So we'll see for utilitarians, the right thing to do is what on balance produces more good than bad results, more happiness versus unhappiness for everyone affected by our actions, or if it's a policy decision, for society as a whole. Now, there's another theory. Some of you may be writing on the term paper topic that touches on ethical and psychological egoism. Are we only motivated by self-interest? Both of them. Now, the problem in ethics is there's a lot of technical terminology. Utilitarianism and ethical egoism fall under a category of moral theories called consequentialist theories. And it's worth noting this because for consequentialism, the only things that are relevant to figuring out the moral rightness or wrongness of what we do are the consequences that that action or those two actions we're comparing would bring about if we were to do them. So consequentialism holds that only consequences are relevant. When I say the moral quality of an action, I mean whether a given thing we might do is morally right or wrong. Now, when I did this little graphic, you'll notice that I've got the C's representing consequences out in front of what you see. That wasn't an accident. It's meant to be suggestive of the fact that consequences of what we do, if we're talking about a timeline, are located where? Not in the past, not in the present, but in the future. And consequentialist theories, because they focus only on the future, only on future consequences of what we might do, make past actions, like whether or not I made a promise in the past, to be morally irrelevant. And this gets to be a criticism of utilitarian reasoning. But if egoism and utilitarianism are both consequentialist theories, where they differ is in their answer to the question, consequences for whom? Now, ethical egoism is controversial because it says the only morally relevant consequences are those for me. And I portray this in this little diagram. You'll notice if the person in kind of brown here is the doer of the action, the person making the moral decision. For egoism, it's only the consequences of that action that they're contemplating for that person that are relevant. And this,
Is it egoism?
Egoism or egoism, yeah.
I'm just making sure that, like, I understand
Yeah, yeah. And the point is that that opens this theory up to controversial things like saying if I were a dishonest repair person, you know, at an auto place, and I knew that I could make more money, that I could benefit my own situation by recommending a $1,000 repair job to you that you don't need and you don't know the difference and you'll get it done. Egoism seems to say that I'm morally right if I benefit. To do that, even if the consequences for you are negative, because egoism says the consequences for you don't matter in moral calculations. Now that makes egoism a very controversial theory. Utilitarianism has been much more appealing to people because it says the consequences we ought to think about. Yeah, pass on. The consequences we ought to think about are not just the consequences for ourselves, but the consequences for anyone affected by our actions. And if we're talking about the consequences of a government policy, like whether or not to build the Bakun Dam, which you saw in the video, we're talking about the consequences for people in the society as a whole. So we saw when we looked at Descartes that he tried to get everything down to one absolutely certain first principle. I think, therefore I am. Right? And I told you that
Cogito ergo sum.
yeah, cogito ergo sum, that's right. And so, and plane geometry, if you'll remember, boils down to 4 or 5 simple axioms or statements. Well, one of the deceptively simple things about utilitarianism, and what makes it appealing to people, is it's easily understandable because the whole moral theory stems from one basic principle, which usually gets called the principle of utility. And here are 2 paraphrases of it. Always act so as to bring about the greatest net good for all those affected by your actions. This page in Solomon is to a much older edition, so it's probably not going to be relevant to your own. Always act for the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And I'm still looking to return my 10th edition up there, so it can be available for somebody else. Now, these definitions, promoting the greatest good for the greatest number, leave something important out. They don't tell us what we're supposed to mean by moral goodness. Now, there's an approach to ethics, so, and I'm not going to ask you the term, sometimes called ethical naturalism, that says that we can define moral goodness, and Aristotle is an example of this, in terms of some non-moral natural property. Remember, for Aristotle was eudaimonia, happiness or well-being. That's a different approach from, like, say, taking Plato's stance that there simply are universal moral principles in a realm beyond the senses. You know, that the form of the good exists as the ultimate standard for moral goodness. These are also called definist theories. What they try to do is get morality down to earth by defining moral goodness in terms of some natural property. And here's, it was quoted in the video, but Bentham and Mill both took refuge in an old theory, not just Aristotle's concept of happiness, but they went back to Greek hedonism and thought if we can define moral goodness in terms of the promotion of pleasure and happiness, and morally bad actions as those that increase the amount of unhappiness or pain in the world, then we've gotten morality down to earth. You know, rather than look for some abstract quality like vice, you know, in an action, we can talk about how willful murder on balance produces much more pain and unhappiness than anything that could ever be gained by that action. So they define the good as the pleasurable and the bad as the painful. Here's Bentham's famous quote. It was in the video. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. So this is Bentham's defense of using hedonism as the standard and adopting a hedonistic standard for moral goodness. So hedonism is the view that only pleasure and happiness is good for its own sake. That any other good is good only, and the word here is instrumentally, only insofar as it promotes pleasure or lessens pain. Now, there's a distinction here between an intrinsic good, that is something that's good for its own sake alone, and what's called an instrumental good. If you're looking for the ultimate standard of ethics, you want something that's good for its own sake, not just because it promotes some other good. Now, here's a very simple illustration of the difference. This is from an old textbook in ethics I used to use years ago. Somebody might say, well, you know what, it's good to eat healthy foods. And you might say, well, why is it good to eat healthy foods? And one answer you could give is that people who eat healthy foods are healthier themselves. But if you go on to say, well, why is it good to be healthy? Now, there are a lot of answers you could give, but one answer you could give is that people who are healthy tend to lead more pleasurable, more satisfying lives, happier lives than those who are unhealthy. But now suppose I went on to say, well, why is it good to be happy? Why is it good to lead a pleasurable life? For hedonists, the buck stops there, because happiness or pleasure is not to be sought and promoted simply because it promotes some other good. It's to be sought for its own sake alone. And so they took happiness or pleasure as the standard. And now, this is in your book on 557. Here's Bentham's original definition of the principle of utility, which is also called the greatest happiness principle, where he puts in as moral goodness happiness. Bentham says, again on 557, by the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever. That is, you can judge any action by this principle according, excuse me, to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or what is the same thing, in other words, to promote or to oppose that happiness. Bentham says, I say of every action whatsoever, and therefore not only of every action of a private individual, but of every measure of government. So Bentham's original intention from the beginning was that utilitarianism would not just be used by individuals in their own personal life to work out and work through personal moral dilemmas, but he wanted it to be used as a tool for policymakers to decide public policy. As we said, that Bentham and Mill were out to reform the British legal system and to right injustices that they saw in that system. And so successful were they that utilitarianism is the reigning theory of punishment in this country as well. If we say, what justifies punishing somebody, and we bring around reasons like the rehabilitation of the offender, punishment as a deterrent to other like crimes in the future, punishment as the protection of society, keeping offenders away from people in society. All those reasons for punishment, none of which have to do with whether or not somebody deserves to be punished for what they did, all of those reasons are utilitarian in nature. They say, if we can get a gain in utility by causing pain and suffering by punishing somebody, in other words, if we can get more positive results than the pain or suffering we're causing in the punished person, then they say punishment is morally justified on utilitarian grounds. So utilitarianism, as I said, is a very influential theory. Mill tried to defend hedonism. I'm not going to stay long on this slide, but basically he said, how can I prove that pleasure is desirable as an end, that we should be hedonists? Well, he says the test of a sound, whether or not it's audible, is that it's able to be heard by people. Well, the test of whether pleasure or happiness is desirable as an end is that people actually do desire pleasure and more pleasurable and happier lives. Well, that meaning of the word desirable, like audible, is basically, all it shows is that pleasure or happiness is able to be desired by people, that it's something people can and do desire. But if you're trying to show that pleasure or happiness ought to be desired as the goal of our actions morally, then you need desirable in a stronger sense. You need to show that it's what we ought to desire, and he never does that. He concludes that it's what we ought to desire, but that's to take desirable in a different sense. And in elementary logic, we call this a fallacy of ambiguity. In other words, you can't change horses in midstream on the meaning of a key term if you're reasoning, because you may not prove what you have set out to prove. And Mill doesn't. And Mill even wrote a very popular logic textbook used in England and the United States in the 19th century. But here he commits a Logic 101 error in trying to defend hedonism. But let's get past that. Very often, in science as well as philosophy, when a view is first advanced or when a theory is first proposed, the people who advance the theory do it in very simple, straightforward terms. And it's only afterwards, when people point up problems with the theory, that the theory gets more complicated. And Bentham thought he could talk about measuring pains and pleasures as the consequences of our actions in entirely quantitative terms. And he thought the only thing we needed to worry about is the quantity of pleasure an action produces or pain. Now, and so for Bentham, all pleasures were on a par if their quantity, if their amount was the same. His famous quotation is, "Quantity of pleasure being equal, pushpin is as good as poetry." Pushpin is a simple child's game, much like pickup sticks. See what he's saying here? That if you get as much pleasure from playing a simple child's game like pickup sticks as you do from reading Maya Angelou or Robert Frost or some other highfalutin poetry, right? Bentham's saying, well, you know, they're all on a par. All pleasures are on a par. Now, this got utilitarianism into some trouble later that Mill tried to get it out of. But we're not going to worry about that at this point. How hot is it in here? Well, we can talk about how hot or cold it is in this room objectively, and we can talk about it quantitatively because there are exact measurable units that are used to measure temperature, right? I mean, this is not news to any of you, right? Let's say it's 69 degrees Fahrenheit. It's probably somewhere in the 70s. So we have units like a degree Fahrenheit or a degree Celsius to measure temperature. And usually if you go into the actual definition of some standard units like foot and yards and meters, they really get down and dirty with technicalities. They're very exact. Well, Bentham thought we could talk about happiness and unhappiness, pains and pleasures, in terms of countable units. He called hedons. This is not the kind of thing you can make up, folks. So plus one hedon would be a unit of pleasure, and minus one hedon would be a unit of pain. And he thought we could compare these, and in what he called a happiness calculus or a hedonistic calculus. It gets various names. Now, one way you would assign these numbers is to take into account factors that you see listed on 558, and I'm not going to go into these in any detail, but the intensity of a pain or pleasure, right? Its duration in time, right? It's a multi-billion-dollar pain reliever industry that says if my headache might go on for 2 or 3 hours if I don't take something, but I can get rid of it in half an hour if I take a certain pain reliever, I'll do it. Right, duration, certainty or uncertainty. If you have $1 and change left after you filled up your tank, and you say, well, I could buy a candy bar for $1 or a lottery ticket. Well, if you hit on the lottery, even on a 3-digit number, presumably you'd get more happiness out of it. in terms of material benefit than just buying a candy bar. But there's 100% certainty you can enjoy that Hershey bar or that bag of chips or whatever that you buy with that dollar, where there's by no means that kind of certainty that you would enjoy the benefits of of winning a lottery. So at any rate, these are the kinds of things, excuse me, that he thought we would take into account and we could actually assign values. And again, Bentham is not saying that in ordinary decisions, you know, what's the right thing to do here? You know, should I have my sandwich on white bread, or is that bad and morally bad for me? You know, maybe I should order a multi-grain bread here. Say I'm at the Subway down there or something. You know, but Bentham thought, again, that if you're talking about complex policy decisions, like say whether or not to build the Bakun Dam, or consider a judge who is tasked with the task of figuring out a fair sentence for a recently convicted criminal. So you want a sentence that's not too harsh, you know, that's unfair in that respect, that it's too harsh a sentence, but you don't want too lenient a sentence that doesn't deter anybody else from the crime, maybe won't contribute to the dependent's rehabilitation, and may not protect society very well. Well, wouldn't it be nice to have a very objective way of figuring this out, just plugging in some numbers and seeing what you get? Well, this was the kind of thing that Bentham had in mind, that utilitarianism would be a very objective way to figure out the moral rightness and wrongness of a public policy decision. Now, sometimes a simple example, now obviously whether or not to build something like the Bakun Dam is a complicated example of utilitarian reasoning, but sometimes if you can see the point with a simple example, and this is one I've used from years from the old Edwards Encyclopedia of Philosophy, you can see it. I was standing waiting for the bus at 10 p.m. last night and watching all the people come out, because I was right down there by the Civic Arena. They had just come out from the circus. The circus is in town, if you haven't heard, maybe for the last time. Suppose an uncle is trying to decide what's the right thing to do, and he's a Benthamite utilitarian. One option I have, thinks the uncle, is to take my nephew to the circus this Saturday. The other option is to stay home and read a book I would like. What's the morally right thing for me to do? And if you're a utilitarian, what on balance produces the most happiness versus unhappiness for everyone concerned, not just for me? So taking your nephew to the circus, let's suppose the uncle, circuses for him are boring, been there, done that, but he'll sit through it. So what Bentham means by pleasure, unhappiness is often just unpleasantness, right? Boredom isn't an actual pain, like a pain in our back, but it's unpleasant to be bored. As I tell people, not everything in life is as exciting as philosophy class. There are boring things out there. So the uncle's boredom, let's say it's -5 hedons. But if the nephew enjoys himself, the uncle will get some sympathetic pleasure from it. In other words, if you have, like, say, a younger sibling or even a child of your own, you get pleasure from seeing them get pleasure at, say, opening a birthday gift or something like that. We call that sympathetic pleasure. So if the nephew enjoys himself, the uncle will get some sympathetic pleasure out of it. But let's suppose the nephew really likes the circus, and he gets 10 hedons worth of pleasure out of it. Well, you do the math, and it's just, this isn't calculus like Laplace and Newton's calculus. This is basically just simple arithmetic. So you get +7 hedons for taking the kid to the circus. Now, what's the other option? Well, you stay home and read a book. Well, adults may not get as intense an experience from doing something like reading a book as a kid gets from the circus. So let's say you get pleasure, but it's only 6 hedons worth of pleasure out of it. But while you're sitting home reading your book Saturday night, you realize that you have disappointed your nephew who really wanted to go to the circus. So you have some sympathetic pain knowing you disappointed your nephew. But then there's the nephew's disappointment itself. Call that -8 hedons. Well, you do the math, and it's -4 on this side. Now, it's not always a plus versus a minus in utilitarian reasoning. It could be a minus versus a bigger minus, or a plus versus a bigger plus. But here, it's a plus versus a minus. So what's the morally right thing to do here? Take the nephew to the circus, right? Now, note, from the uncle's perspective, it's not the choice that gives him, on balance, the most pleasure, right? He's got -5 + 2, or -3 hedons by taking the nephew to the circus, whereas he's got +4, +6 - 2 hedons by staying at home reading the book. But he's not an egoist, he's a utilitarian, and he's worried about the pains and pleasures for everyone affected by his actions. Now, is it pretty obvious to you that this is what the math would be, what these values would be? I mean, that it would be -5 for the uncle's boredom, and +6 for the reading pleasure of the uncle. That's a loaded question, right? It's a trick question. The objection that's raised, the way Bentham originally thought about it, is wait a second. Pains and pleasures, aren't they subjective? How do I know how much pain or pleasure a given action would give you? Suppose the kid doesn't enjoy the circus. Suppose he doesn't get +10 hedons, but maybe +2, hardly enjoys it at all. Then maybe the math says stay at home and read the book. So it's unrealistic to think that pleasures and pains can be compared in this way. They're subjective and not open to public inspection. But now we can get precise scientific technical definitions for things like what counts as a meter in length, what counts as a degree Celsius or Kelvin or whatever in temperature. But can we really do that objectively? Can we get a non-subjective measure of pain and pleasure? In other words, can we really specify what's to count as 1 hedon's worth of pleasure or -1 hedon's worth of pain? And the answer is no. I mean, there's really no way to do it. And the point I make in this last slide is the subjective quality of pleasures and pains makes standardization of a countable unit extremely problematic. But the point is, how do you know how much of something you have? How do you know whether you have 2 or 10 or 20 hedons worth of pleasure unless you first know what is to count as 1 hedon's worth of pleasure? And it's what's to count as 1 hedon's worth of pleasure that's very hard to define. Now, one response that utilitarians give, and you saw Jonathan Glover do that in the video, is we do make common sense, everyday, rough and ready comparisons. If somebody says, hey, look, my headache today is much worse than the one I had yesterday, you know, they're not talking gibberish. And they're saying something that is probably true. It is much worse. And even hospitals have a scale where they can say, what's your pain today on a sliding scale of 1 through 10. But they understand that whatever report the patient is giving is basically their subjective assessment of the number. There's no objective way to measure pains and pleasures. So saying that we can make rough and ready comparisons isn't the same thing as saying that we can assign the exact numerical values that Bentham thought we could to pains and pleasures. So that's a real problem with utilitarianism as Bentham first saw it. And that's a good place to stop because we get into John Stuart Mill. People criticized utilitarianism and Bentham's version of it for putting all pains and pleasures on a par if their quantity was equal, because as this slide says, it didn't give us a way to make a distinction between the pleasures of human beings and those of, say, non-human animals, like the pig out there in the field. In other words, Bentham's claim that all pleasures are on a par means that if, say, somebody really enjoys the symphony, a very highbrow type of pleasure, but if the pig out there in the field gets as much pleasure from eating his daily ration of slop as you get from going to the symphony, for Bentham, all pleasures are on a par. And they said, well, this gives us a very low picture of human beings. Now, Bentham was getting quite old by the time these criticisms came in, and so it was sort of left to his student, John Stuart Mill, to defend utilitarianism against it. So we'll look at Mill and Utilitarianism Monday.